Hey everyone, welcome back. We're diving into some pretty crucial stuff today, especially if you're one of those dedicated folks prepping for the UPSC exams.
Definitely a topic that's been making waves.
Yeah, we're going deep on India's ranking in, well, a recent Global Free Speech Index.
Hmm.
How much does India really support free speech?
Right. All based on a report, Who in the World Supports Free Speech? From the Future of Free Speech, a U.S. think tank, by the way.
So fresh data.
Oh, yeah. Survey ran in October 2024. Gives us a pretty up-to-date picture.
Okay, so spill it. Where does India land in all of this?
So out of 33 countries surveyed, India comes in at 24th.
Middle of the pack. Not great, not terrible.
Right. Well, the score itself is 62.6, puts us between South Africa, they got 66.9, and Lebanon a bit lower at 61.8. But it's more complicated than just the number, you see.
I knew there had to be a twist. You were saying something about a disconnect before we started recording. Exactly. Here's the thing. In India, there's this growing feeling that free speech is actually improving, right? But then you have these international assessments, and they're suggesting, well, maybe not. Maybe things are backsliding a bit.
Interesting. So what we're trying to do today, I guess, is figure out what's really going on, use the survey data to, unpack that discrepancy, see if India's free speech situation is as rosy as some people think.
Absolutely. And I think for UPSC aspirants, this is gold. Analyzing these kinds of complex issues, seeing different perspectives, it's all there in the syllabus.
Totally. Okay, so before we get lost in the Indian paradox, let's set the scene. Globally, who's leading the charge on free speech? Any surprises in the rankings?
Globally, not many shockers, honestly.
Yeah.
Top spots, as usual, go to the Scandinavian countries. Norway's crushing it at 87.9. Denmark right behind with 87.0.
Always those guys. Predictable, I guess, but good for them.
Right. Now, further down it gets more interesting. We see countries that, well, they often get criticized for their free speech records.
Places that maybe aren't so open to dissent.
Yeah, but here's the thing. Places like Indonesia, Malaysia, Pakistan, they showed some of the biggest improvements in their scores. They're still ranked lower overall, but public opinion seems to be shifting in a positive direction.
Huh. So maybe there's hope, even in places where things seem a bit restrictive. But you said there were other, more unexpected results?
Yeah, there's this other layer. Some countries that, lean towards the, shall we say, authoritarian side of things.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Who are we talking about?
Hungary's one. Their score is a whopping 85.5.
Okay.
And then there's Venezuela at 81.8.
Wait, hold on. Countries that we often think of as clamping down on dissent are ranking high on public perception of free speech. That seems counterintuitive.
It highlights a super important point. Just because free speech is, guaranteed on paper, and even if people feel like they can speak freely, that doesn't always reflect the actual reality of how free a country is, how much democratic freedom truly exists.
Good point. Layers upon layers here. Okay, well, let's circle back to India now. We've got this 24th place ranking. We've got this Indian paradox, right? Where things seem good on the surface, but maybe not so much underneath. What does this survey tell us about what Indians believe about free speech compared to what might be happening in reality?
This is where the nuances really kick in. The survey, it found that most Indians, they do believe in free speech. They say the government shouldn't censor stuff, which, by the way, aligns with the whole, fundamental rights thing enshrined in the Indian Constitution. Pretty crucial stuff for UPSC prep, right?
Okay, so that's good. Indians generally believe in free speech. Back to basics, just like the Constitution says. But you said this is where it gets tricky.
Yeah, see, it's when we start looking at specifically criticizing government policies, that's where the support drops, significantly. Way lower in India than the global average.
Give me some numbers. Just how much lower are we talking here?
All right, brace yourself. 37% of Indians who responded to the survey, they agreed that the government should have the power to stop people from criticizing its policies.
Wow, that's a huge chunk of people.
And get this. It's the highest percentage out of all 33 countries in the entire survey. For comparison, in the UK, only 5% felt that way. And Denmark, 3%.
Okay, that's a stark contrast. I mean, almost 40% of Indians think the government should be able to silence critics. That's got to be concerning for democracy, right? What's driving that kind of sentiment?
So the survey doesn't, dig deep into the why behind this specific number. But, we can kind of speculate. Maybe it's cultural norms, the whole respect for authority thing. Or maybe it's levels of trust in government, or even, the increasing social polarization we've been seeing.
Yeah, lots of factors at play there. But the takeaway is a significant portion of the population is, okay with restricting speech that challenges the government.
Exactly. And that brings us back to the disconnect we talked about earlier.
Right, because while some Indians might feel like their freedom to speak has improved, the international community is painting a different picture.
100%. The report actually states that even though folks in India and South Africa felt like their ability to speak freely had gotten better, international rankings show a decline in free speech protections, especially in India.
So the perception doesn't match reality, but why? What's causing this backsliding, as the report calls it?
They're saying that while the laws guaranteeing free speech might be there, the way those laws are used and the overall atmosphere for free speech, it's getting more and more restricted. They actually put India in the same category as Hungary and Venezuela, experiencing this democratic backsliding even with those high public perception scores on free speech.
Okay, this is getting serious. So it's not just about having laws on the books, it's about how those laws are actually enforced, how much space there really is for dissent.
Exactly.
Let's get specific then. What are some concrete examples of this democratic backsliding when it comes to free speech in India?
We got to look at the legal framework, but also the political and social climate, right?
Yeah.
Starting with the law, we've got the sedition law, that's section 124A of the Indian Penal Code.
The sedition law. It always seems to be in the news, right?
For good reason. It's been used time and time again to silence those who are critical of the government. A lot of folks see it as a tool for suppressing political dissent.
I remember reading somewhere that it's a colonial era law. Seems kind of outdated for a modern democracy.
You're right, it is. And its continued existence in our legal system. Yeah. A huge debate. Then you've got the Unlawful Activities Prevention Act, or UAPA for short.
UAPA? Yeah, I've heard of that one.
It's meant to counter terrorism, right?
Yeah.
But there's a growing concern that it's being used much more broadly, like against journalists, activists, political opposition, people who are critical of the government.
So even if the intention was good, the application might not be.
Exactly. And it can have a chilling effect that goes way beyond its direct use. People get scared to speak out, knowing that these laws could be used against them.
Self-censor, right.
Exactly. It creates this atmosphere where people think, okay, better stay quiet if I don't want trouble. And that's not good for healthy public discourse.
No, not at all. Are there any other legal things we should be aware of?
Oh, yeah. We can't forget the IT rules of 2021. They give the government a lot of power to control content on social media and digital news platforms.
The internet. Always a tricky area when it comes to free speech.
It is. And there's a real worry that these powers could be used to censor legitimate online expression. It's a tough balancing act, figuring out how to regulate the online world without stifling free speech.
Okay, so we've got the laws themselves. But you also mentioned the broader climate, the actions of people and institutions.
Right. The report, it doesn't explicitly say this, but we can see that self-censorship is on the rise. People are afraid of legal action. They're afraid of online harassment, all sorts of things. They don't want to risk speaking their minds.
And the media plays a role in this too, right? I mean, we've heard stories about journalists facing pressure, both political and economic.
Absolutely. Media houses, they're under pressure from all sides. It can lead to biased reporting or even just avoiding critical topics altogether. It all contributes to a less diverse, less informative media landscape.
So it's like this. The laws are there, but the environment surrounding those laws can be just as restrictive, if not more.
And it's not even applied equally across the board.
What do you mean?
There seems to be this, selective tolerance when it comes to free speech. People might support the idea in general, but that support disappears if the speech challenges their political views, their religious beliefs, or, comes from marginalized groups.
We've seen that play out in real life, haven't we?
Oh, yeah. We've seen activists, journalists, even comedians getting arrested or facing legal trouble for expressing certain views. It shows you that those free speech rights, they aren't always applied consistently.
So we've got a bit of a puzzle here. Public opinion that's kind of mixed, a legal system that can be restrictive, and a social and political climate that puts pressure on people to stay silent. Not a great picture for free speech in India. It's complicated. So for our listeners out there, especially those studying hard for the UPSC exams, folks who want to build a better, more democratic India, what can we do? What are the steps we can take to make sure free speech is actually protected, not just in theory, but in practice?
Huge question, and so relevant for future civil servants. First things first, we got to strengthen those legal safeguards. Take a good look at laws like the sedition law, the UAPA, maybe even repeal or amend them. Make sure they can't be misused to silence legitimate dissent.
So back to the laws, making sure they're actually fair and just.
Exactly. And we need a strong, independent judiciary to make sure those laws are applied correctly. Nobody's getting unfairly targeted.
Yeah, checks and balances, right.
Exactly. Second thing, we got to cultivate a culture of open debate. That's where education comes in. And a responsible media. Creating spaces where people can engage with different viewpoints respectfully, even if they disagree. And political parties.
Yeah.
They need to walk the walk, show a real commitment to free speech, even when it's their opponents doing the talking.
So it's about building a society that values open discussion, even when it gets uncomfortable.
Exactly. Third thing, and this is big in today's world, we have to protect digital and media freedom. That means making sure journalists are safe from pressure from both the government and corporations. And when it comes to online content, those regulations, they can't be used to censor legitimate speech. It's a tough balance, but we got to find it.
Yeah, the online world, always a challenge.
And finally, we need to bridge that gap between how people perceive free speech and what's actually happening on the ground. Educate people about their rights, encourage fact-based discussions about government policies and politics in general. The more informed people are, the better they can understand, value, and protect these freedoms.
So it's a multi-pronged approach, strengthening the laws, fostering a culture of debate, protecting the digital space, and educating the public. Seems like a lot of work.
It is, but it's worth it. A healthy democracy depends on it.
Absolutely. So to sum up for our listeners, India's at 24th place in this global free speech index. Not terrible, but definitely room for improvement. And then there's this whole disconnect between how people feel about free speech and what's actually happening. Lots of challenges, but also lots of opportunities.
And for a truly vibrant democracy, something that's like super central to your UPSC studies, protecting free speech is non-negotiable. It's not enough to just write it down in the Constitution. It has to be a living, breathing thing. People need to be able to speak their minds without fear.
That's a great point. Okay, before we wrap up, I've got a final thought for everyone to ponder. How does this tension, between a big chunk of the public wanting to restrict criticism of the government and the whole idea of free expression, how does that tension shape our democracy, our political discourse, our governance? It's a question worth thinking about, especially if you're going to be one of the people shaping India's future. And for our UPSC folks, these kinds of nuanced understandings are crucial. You need to be able to analyze these complexities, draw insights from sources like, the Hindu. It's all part of the prep, whether you're writing those killer essays for mains or tackling those tricky prelims questions on fundamental rights and democratic principles.
You hit the nail on the head. Digging into these issues using reliable sources like the Hindu, it'll deepen your understanding of India's political landscape and sharpen those analytical skills. It's all connected.
Yeah.
Couldn't have said it better myself. All right, folks, that's a wrap for today's Deep Dive. If you found this analysis helpful, please hit that like button and subscribe to the Deep Dive for more discussions on the issues that matter. And hey, we love hearing from you. Drop us a comment with your thoughts, questions, or even suggestions for future topics. Oh, and don't forget, we pulled most of our info for today's Deep Dive from the Hindu's coverage of the Future of Free Speech's Global Free Speech Index. Thanks for joining us, and we'll catch you on the next one.
See you then.